Simon, welcome to the Happier at Work podcast. I feel such an honor to have you as my guest today. We have been connected, I'd say, for a few years now on Facebook. I don't even remember how we first connected. But one thing that stood out for me, Simon, on my birthday, you were one of the only people, I think, to send a voice note through Messenger. So I feel like it's such an honor to have you. And I can just see how you're living your values all the time as well. Do you want to tell people a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are today?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the show. My background is I was born here in the United Kingdom to two Malaysian Chinese parents who had emigrated here for a better life. And when I grew up, I had this mistaken belief that success was defined by my job title. So be a banker, be a doctor, be a lawyer, be an accountant. And so when I finished secondary school, I started at the London School of Economics. I studied economics. And when I graduated, it was the middle of 2007, which was probably the worst possible time to begin a career in the financial services industry.
Mm.
To make things a little more interesting, the first company that I joined with was Lehman Brothers, which collapsed 14 months after I joined. So talk about a volatile start to your first career. This was as volatile as you could get. Now, it was admittedly painful at the time, as it is for anybody who has gone through redundancy or restructuring or even seeing your company collapse.
Mm.
But in hindsight, it was a beautiful blessing in disguise because it kickstarted the journey to where I am today. I started to ask myself, what did success mean to me? And what sort of impact did I want to have in the world? Those two questions, even though they are simple in terms of how they come across, they are actually very important questions. Firstly, many of us are exhausted not because we are doing too much, but because we're doing too little of the things that bring us joy and often running someone else's race. And that's why it is so important to understand what does success mean for ourselves. The second question about what sort of impact did I want to have in the world, that's an important question because our value as a human is determined by how much more we have given to the world than we have taken from it. So I remember writing down all of the ideas and insights that came to my head on a blank sheet of paper. And then I started to circle the items, words, and sentences that stood out to me. And I just got exploring. I got exploring my curiosities. Now, I deliberately mention exploring my curiosities rather than purpose because at the time I simply did not know what my purpose was. A lot of us use the excuse that I'm not going to begin until I know what my purpose is. Instead of focusing on my purpose, I just started with what I was most curious about. And that led me to the world of coaching. While I was balancing a 9 to 5 job, I was in and out of the financial services industry. I was moving from job to job because it was very difficult to keep down a role for more than a few years. I enrolled with a company called the Coaching Academy, and I signed up for two of their programs. And within a couple of years, I had these coaching qualifications. And I started to coach anybody and everyone that wanted to be coached to build my experience. And from there, I got invitations to speak at different companies and conferences. And then I had exposure in the media through interviews on Sky News and the BBC, all the way to April 2020, where I landed a book deal with Penguin to write my first book, Energize. And so I'd gone on this journey from being in the corporate world to quitting that, embarking on the entrepreneurial path, and building multiple businesses around what I was most passionate about.
Brilliant. Absolutely love that. And it's such an inspirational story, I think. And I'm sure there's so many people who can relate. I'd love to pick up on a couple of things that you said there about purpose and people kind of almost using this idea of I haven't found my purpose or I'm not going to start until I find what my purpose is, using that as an excuse not to get started with changing the way things are. And this is something that I've spoken about a lot recently, this concept of purpose. And I love how you articulated that sometimes it becomes this barrier to us because we haven't, just because we don't know what that purpose is, we feel like we can't do something different or we're waiting almost for inspiration to hit us, rather than, exactly as you described, explore the things that are you're interested in, that you're curious
Mm,
about.
mm. It's true. I mean, you don't wake up one morning and know what you want to do for the rest of your life unless you are starring in a Hollywood film. The reality is we get given clues, we have insights, we have inspirations, and the onus is on us to explore them, to see where they may lead. I mean, I know this because when I was in the financial industry, I spent most of my day working alongside colleagues in finance. After work, I would go drinking with people in finance. On the weekends, I would spend time with people in finance. And so I very quickly became aware of the fact that I was living in a bit of a bubble
Mm,
and that that was the only world that I knew. And so, of course, I didn't know what my purpose was because I never explored anything out of it. And so, the easiest way to discover what we are meant to do is to just explore things outside of the ordinary, to expose our mind to new ideas and insights, to look at people doing things that bring them joy and try and understand how they got there. What were the things they did that helped them discover what brings them alive?
mm,
And the more I did that by going to workshops, seminars, talking to people who had experienced some sort of success in their own lives or their careers, opened my mind to potential avenues that I then started to read about, watch videos about, and research to understand if it was for me.
brilliant. Absolutely, I love that. And this I suppose term of success has come up again. In, you're looking at other people, and how would you define success? And again, this is something that I've talked about on the podcast recently, where, you know going back to your earlier point of success kind of means I'm a doctor, I'm an accountant, I'm a lawyer, or something
Mm,
like that. It's always these external factors. And it's ingrained in us as a society, I think, a lot of the time, that this is what the perception is. You have a big house, you have a fancy car, you have a nice job title. All of these things are the outward view of what people
mm.
perceive success to be. So, do you want to talk to us a little bit more about that journey that you took, and what you define as success?
Sure. So you're right. For me, when I was at the beginning of my career, success was very much defined by career virtues, which are things such as my job title, how much I earn, the company I work for, the brand I work for. And those things are great to have on your CV and to show off to other people. But actually, what I quickly learned is that success really is about legacy virtues, the story you've written, the lives that you've impacted, what you've given to the world. It is actually the legacy virtues that people talk about when we pass from this world. So for me, as I grew older and wiser, I started to understand that success was all about progress and living a life that is aligned to our values and what is most important. Now, again, this will be different for each of us. For some people, success could simply be being a great parent. Success could be having a sufficient income that you can do all the things that you didn't think you could do before. It could be different for each of us. And that's why the longest journey that we as humans take are the inches from our heads to our hearts. Never an easy journey, but the most important that we will ever take. Because as we get to know ourselves at a deeper level, we get to really understand what is most important. And that's why, as the popular saying goes, you cannot have self-development without self-awareness.
Mm,
You've got to know who you are, what you stand for, what is most important for you before you know what action to take. Otherwise, you can take lots of actions, but you end up running in circles without making actual progress. And so that for me is success, is living a life aligned to your values. It's living a life where you get to do the things that bring you joy and where you can progress forward each day.
mm.
And it's why often when I get asked, Simon, what are the goals that you have? Of course, I've got a vision of where I would like to be, but I'm not attached to it because as long as I'm focused on just this one goal, which is to be better than who I was yesterday, all the rewards I seek, they will naturally come in their own time. I'm not attached to when or how. I simply trust that if I focus on the process, if I focus on improving myself to be a little bit better than who I was yesterday, everything will naturally flow from there.
I love that. Absolutely love that. So, Coming back to this idea of what success is, and it's that taking progress and being living in alignment with your values. Um, and something that sprung to mind for me is thinking about how you'll be remembered. So if you're talking about your legacy virtues, it's how you're remembered, and that doesn't even have to mean how you'll be remembered after you die, but how will you be remembered by the impact that you have on other people? What stories will they tell about you when you're not there? You know, so how do you want to be thought of? That's kind of what springs to mind in relation to that. Values is something that I talk about a lot, especially in a career context,
Yeah.
in relationship to how we show up at work, what behaviors we observe in people at work, and what companies say their values are versus what they really are. Any thoughts around that?
Well, values is interesting because a lot of people would say to me, value sounds great, Simon. You know, living life aligned with my values is great, but how do I know what my values are?
Hmm.
How do I know what is most important? I haven't had the chance to really reflect on that. And an exercise I get them to do, which I think will be useful for anybody who hasn't got the clarity on what their values are, is to write down the names of 7 people, dead or alive, that inspire you. So they could be well-known thought leaders. They could be people only known to you. They could be celebrities. They could be people in the public eye, whoever they are. Write down 7 names, dead or alive, of people that inspire you. And then next to those names, write down why do they inspire you? What are the qualities they demonstrate that inspire you? So it could be brilliant communicators. It could be the impact they've had through the work that they do. Just jot down some bullet points next to each name on what is it specifically they do or embrace that inspire you. Once you've got that down on paper, that starts to show you what you value, because what you value in them is important to you. That's
Hmm.
why you're inspired by that.
Yeah.
So when you put that down onto paper, then you should then ask yourself, how much of this am I embracing in my own life?
Love that. Yeah, yeah. And I think that the thing with values, like it's a topic I could never tire of talking about, I think. Although I'm saying that now and I'm like, maybe I maybe I've spoken too soon. But for me it's something I feel like it warrants a lot of attention because it's so
Mm,
important in our lives. Um in the context, I'm kind of thinking of what you're saying and looking at people out there who inspire you, but maybe it's bringing it back to organization level. Is there anyone in your organization who you feel inspired by, or is it the opposite? And therefore, maybe that's cause for concern. And an
mm,
earlier conversation I had in relation to values themselves was this idea that it's one thing to have values, it's another thing to communicate what those values are, and it's another thing again to actually be in an environment where those values are actively lived. And I'm
yeah.
talking in the organizational context, so any I'd love to hear your views on, I suppose, applying that same concept but in an organization, and any experiences that you've had that have kind of gone against that.
Definitely. Well, first of all, the reason why values are important in an organization is because unless you are clear on what they are, you will end up hiring the wrong people.
Mm,
You know, you can hire someone because they have a great skill set or they've got a great background. But if you're not clear on what the values are of your organization, they might come in and bring with them a toxic culture.
yes,
They might bring
absolutely.
toxicity into the environment. And what happens is you hire all these people just because of the skill set they have, but you haven't tested if they match the values of your organization. And very quickly you have to end up firing them because they're sabotaging your progress. However, when you are clear on the values of your organization, you can test for that in the questions that you ask in an interview.
Mm,
Because you ask any company, they will often say from experience that it is far better to hire for values and teach them the skills they need than to hire for skills with someone who lacks the values that they desire. And so I think that's where it begins, is getting clear on what values your organization holds dear. And then it's to embrace it.
mm,
It's one thing to tell your teams and your employees, this is what we stand for.
mm.
but you don't embody it.
Yeah.
It's like when you raise a child as a parent, your child often won't do what you tell it to do, but it will follow your actions.
Yes.
And it's the same thing with leadership.
Yeah.
So when you tell your employees to do this or to do that, and you yourself don't embrace that principle of value, that action or inaction communicates far more powerfully.
Yeah. Yeah. 100% agree. And no matter what that is, if you're saying, like, one example that we had, for example, on last week's podcast episode was the idea that if there's a policy in place where it's no mobile phones in a meeting,
Mm,
and everyone's kind of sticking to that rule, and along comes the CEO pulls out his or her phone in the meeting and is checking it, but no one is speaking up because it's the CEO. You don't want to go
mm,
against that, but that goes against the values. But it also sends the message to other people, either that we're creating an us
mm,
and them culture, and if you're at a senior enough level, it's okay to check your phone during a meeting, and it's creating kind of an us and them
mm.
divide, or it's showing to everyone that they can take their phone out in meetings, and just because there's a policy in place, no one's actually following it.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you look at studies done into what makes for effective teams, what you quickly discover is that one of the most common characteristics is that of shared vulnerability. When everyone can share and be vulnerable at the same time, what happens is you actually get more done.
Mm,
One of the interesting studies was into the world of sports. If you have a sports team where there are two star players and they get preferential treatment and are seen to be different from everyone else, that team finds it far harder to succeed in the long term. Whereas if you have a team where there are no egos or star players, but where everybody is treated equally and they approach things as a team, they can share in the wins and the losses and they can be vulnerable with one another. What happens is that team actually does really well over the long term, far better than the other teams that rely on one or two star players. In the world of football, they looked at a team like Germany. Why has Germany consistently done well going back decades in international football tournaments? Well, it's because when you look at the way the team plays, they literally play as a team. There's no star player. There's goals that come from across the team.
mm,
Whereas when you have and the ones that came up with teams like Portugal or England or Spain, where you're relying on one or two key players, so much so that they influence how the teams show up
yeah.
because they're treated differently.
Mm.
And so I think we've got to look at the culture and dynamic of people within a team to really see how we can shift that to one that works more as a unit rather than as silos.
I love that. And I can totally understand the football analogy. And I was just thinking I probably couldn't name someone
Mm.
in particular to say, this is the star player, and someone's always passing it to them so that they can go and score.
Mm.
But I suppose just putting that into a work context, and there's so many relations, I think, between what happens in sport, especially on the psychology side of things, and what happens in business. And I think there's a lot to be learned in that. But I do love this idea that there's no stars, there's no ego, but it's about what each person individually brings as their strengths, and
Yeah.
each person is required to do their job in order to work as a team effectively, and bringing that sense of vulnerability or psychological safety. So it's okay to speak up, it's okay to
Yeah.
say, to challenge the status quo, it's okay to, like, I love playing devil's advocate.
Mm.
What if this isn't the right answer? Can we maybe have a think about something else, just to challenge how we're actually doing things? And absolutely right, it's all about the behaviors of the people and
Mm.
recognizing. And I think having shared values can connect people in such a powerful way.
Mm.
When
Mm.
I was doing my research for my master's, this was a key area of focus. Another core thing that came from that I didn't kind of study in further detail, but it was part of that same thing, was this idea of shared goals.
Mm.
And I think
Mm.
it's so important to know what direction you're heading, so that collectively you can be able to prioritize. You can think about, well, what is the most important thing here when we
Mm.
take the bigger picture of what the organization is trying to achieve.
Definitely. And this is why I think vulnerability is so important. And one of the things I often say to companies is that vulnerability does not make you any less of a leader. It simply makes you more human. And in today's world, people crave that. You know, we crave connection, and vulnerability is the gateway drug to connection. And so when a leader says to the employees, I need help, or can you offer insights on this challenge we have? You're showing that you're human. You're showing that you don't know it all and you want to be alongside your employees to figure it out together. Going back to what you said just now about shared goals. And referencing sport one more time, because another story comes to my mind, is that when you do face a challenge, you share in the learning together. Not saying it's all your fault, but actually, I've got something wrong as well.
Mm.
I have to take some responsibility for this as well, which is difficult to say in a moment when you're in the position of a leader, but actually the value and impact that has is profound.
Mm.
When Manchester United last September, so September 2022, lost a match 3-0 against Brentford,
Mm.
the manager called the players back on the weekend, which they would have had off with their families.
Yeah.
He called them back and said, I want you to run the distance that you did not run compared to the other team. So the gap in distance, I want you to run to make that up because I didn't see you working hard enough. Now, the first response from the players was like, well, why are we doing this? Why have we just been called in and being punished to run that when I could be spending my Sunday with my family? But what shocked them was when they came to the training ground, their manager was also dressed in sports gear to run the miles with them.
Mm.
And that changed the respect they had for the manager.
Yeah.
The manager wasn't standing there telling them they've got to run this distance. He was there alongside them, despite his age, running the same distance. We failed. We are going to work through this together.
Mm.
How
Yeah.
often do we see that in business?
Dare I say, I'm not sure how often we see that at all. But I love that. And something else that sprung to my mind when you're talking about leaders being vulnerable and asking for help is it's a degree of humility, but it's also showing
Mm,
the employees that they feel valued as well, because you're seeking out their opinion. And since
mm,
often they are the ones who are closest to the coalface, they are the ones
mm,
who are doing the 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 bulk of the work, whether they're facing clients, all of that, they're probably much closer to solving the problem
mm.
anyway. Um, so yeah, I mean, absolutely love that. Any kind of additional thoughts around this topic of values before we move on?
Yeah, I think one other thing to keep in mind is that when we think about an organization, especially those in leadership positions, we talk about the customer experience. You know, how are we going to deliver better service to our clients? How we're going to win more business for our company. But what we forget is that when you are at the top of a hierarchy in a company, your actual first customer is your employees.
Mm.
Now, if you manage that employee experience well, they will look after your clients and customers. Because when they're happy and they have a high level of energy that they bring to their job, guess what? The way they connect and the way they communicate to your clients is going to be vastly different.
Mm.
And so your first customer is your employee.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And I have a quote on my LinkedIn just at the bottom of my profile from Richard Branson, actually. And he says, look after your employees and they'll look after your
Mm,
customers. So you need to
mm,
put your employees first as a leader because they're the ones who are actually looking after your employees.
mm,
And I saw another interesting post this morning again on LinkedIn talking about stakeholders and how employees should be included in that, that it's not just our stakeholders are the shareholders or they're the leaders or they are the customers. The stakeholders need to include the employee and the experience
mm,
that they have of the work as well. So I thought that was an interesting perspective. I'm starting to see a huge shift in how we talk about work
mm.
and how we value employees at work as well. And I think the companies that don't value employees, they're going to quickly see, high levels of turnover when people start realizing there is more out there, that they can go somewhere where they feel valued.
Definitely, definitely.
Absolutely. I'd love, Simon, in the last few minutes to talk about your book. I have a copy of your book here, a nice signed copy of your book. So, anyone who is not watching, so I do put these onto YouTube as well. Anyone who's watching on, or sorry, anyone who's listening to this on audio, you won't see a picture of the book Energize, but we will put links to it in the show notes below. I suppose I'd love to hear about the journey of that. What prompted you to write the book, and what are some of the key lessons that people can take from it?
Sure. So the reason I wrote Energize, and just to give a bit of background for the listeners, is that when I put the book proposal forward, the working title was actually Energy is Everything. And
Ah.
then through the editing process, we condensed that to Energize.
Mm.
And the reason I wanted to write that was twofold. Firstly, I had gone on this journey where I was at a point where I had no energy from a physical, a mental, an emotional, and a spiritual perspective. When when I left Lehman Brothers after the collapse of the company, I moved into a hedge fund, which on the outside was very glamorous. Simon's working in a hedge fund, but the reality is it was far from that.
Mm.
I was very junior. I was working long hours. I got burnt out. A story that I share in the first chapter of the book, where it really impacted my health. And I was directionless because this career that I had imagined would make me successful was now a career people didn't want to be a part of. The public had gone from seeing bankers as these very intelligent people to people that caused this crisis.
Mm.
And,
Yeah.
and so with that came a different perception of the career that I'd now embarked on. And so to have gone from there to where I am today, where I wake up every morning filled with possibility, inspired by things that I can achieve, excited by the unknown and being comfortable with the uncomfortable, I wanted to share how I transitioned from one to the other. And with that came a focus on energy within four dimensions: the physical, the mental, the emotional, and the spiritual. The physical was the first thing that I started to address. And the physical are things such as your sleep, your movement, and your nutrition. Now, if you get that right, you give yourself a good base level of energy. But that's not the only factor to consider.
Mm.
Most of us will only focus on that and wonder why we're still exhausted. And that's because we still have the other three dimensions.
Mm.
Mental energy is your ability to focus, to access your creativity, and tap into a more resilient mindset. Your emotional energy is how you relate to yourself, how you relate to others, and how you deal when things don't always turn out the way you would like. And then spiritual energy is all about meaning and purpose. You may have good physical energy, but if you're doing work that drains and exhausts you and goes against your values, you're still going to feel exhausted and drained. So that's the first reason. The second reason behind writing the book Energize is whenever I would come down from stage after giving a talk to an audience, I would have a number of people come to me and say, Simon, I loved your energy on that stage. If I only had a small percentage of the energy you have, I could go on and accomplish so much with my life.
Mm.
And so I wanted to speak to that as well. How did I get to a point where I was able to create that transfer of energy between myself and the audience
Mm.
to inspire, to empower, and to energize so they can go on to do the same? So those were the two reasons that compelled me to write the book. Now, what's inside the book? What can you expect? Well, the way I put the book together was to divide it into four parts, which in essence was the journey that I took. The first part of the book is awaken. How do we awaken that energetic power within us? The second part of the book is then about rewire. How do we rewire the way we see our reality and how we show up in the world? The third part is about protecting your energy. And the fourth part is about supercharge, which is all about supercharging your legacy. Remember what I shared earlier about career virtues and legacy virtues? It's now bringing us to a point of thinking about our future, thinking about the story we want to write so that we can supercharge ourselves in the present moment.
Love that. Absolutely love the story. And I think it's so nice because it comes from a place of, like you were saying, you were working in a job that from the
Mm,
outside was perceived as really glamorous, but on the
mm,
inside, and I think oftentimes going back to what we were talking about earlier in relation to success, we
mm,
have these definitions in our head of what success will look like. Working for a prestigious bank, for example, earning a high salary, working in a particular industry, and other people think, wow, Simon, you're amazing, you're doing incredibly well. But on the inside, you're like, how did I get here? And this does not feel
mm,
good to me. And I feel exhausted all the time and I'm burning out and all of these things.
yeah,
So I think it's really refreshing to hear that honesty from someone as well, and having the courage to make that change, because I see so many people who say that they don't want the situation, that they're not happy in the situation that they find themselves in, but they're actually not doing anything
mm,
about it. And again, to your earlier point, I wonder, is that to do with like, oh, well, I haven't found my purpose, or I have no
mm,
idea what it is I want to do, so I'm not going to move from a situation I'm unhappy because I don't know what the next move actually is. But then to get to that stage, and I'd love to explore a little bit, like,
mm.
because I would imagine sometimes people have the perception, and people sometimes would say this to me as well, that you think you have everything together because you have it all figured out. But do you want to like talk to us about the reality? Like, it's hard to implement all
Yeah,
of this stuff all of the time.
it is hard. I mean, the reality is you're always going to have challenges.
Yeah.
Whatever stage of the journey you're at, you're always going to have challenges. Whether you
Mm,
just started a company, or you're in a senior management position, or you've just started a business, or you're scaling a business, you're always going to have challenges. Challenges are a part of life,
mm,
especially when you embark on a path you have never been on before. Now, what we come to learn, just as I have, is that those things do not matter nearly as much as how we choose to respond to them.
mm,
Our response is what makes us. It's what determines how far we go in life. Now, you're going to face challenges big and small every single day. But ultimately, the way to make the progress you want and not to let them defeat you is to focus on what you can control, however small. And there is always something that you can control. What actually happens is that many of us focus on the things we cannot control.
yeah.
And when you spend too much time and energy focused on the things that you cannot control, you become paralyzed by overthinking. And you can't help but feel more negative and powerless. But when you focus on the things that you can control, you become empowered and energized to take action. And sometimes all it requires is a little bit of courage to take a small step forward. And that in turn develops the confidence that you need to keep going. And as you take more and more small steps forward, what happens is that you create this feeling of momentum. And once you've got that feeling of momentum behind you, you just want to continue taking more and more action steps. And that bias towards action is the biggest differentiator between those who experience exponential levels of success and those who watch from the sidelines and wish they could be there.
Mm. I love that. And this idea that it's about taking a small step forward, I think oftentimes we believe that we need to feel confident and feel motivated before taking action, but actually it's the other way around. By
Mm,
taking that small action step, it builds that confidence, it builds that momentum, and we don't have to rely on motivation if we've committed
mm,
to taking action in the first place. And I love this idea that bias towards action is the differentiator between someone who, from the outside, has this success versus someone who is looking on from the sideline thinking,
mm,
I wish I was like Simon. I wish I could do that. It's
mm.
like, okay, so what's stopping you? And I
Yeah.
suppose I'm trying to encourage people to think, what is stopping them? Again, this idea that what we can control versus what we can't control, and I can't remember. I'd love to be able to quote the author of this, the kind of circle of control, the circle of
Mm,
influence, and the circle that's basically completely beyond our
mm,
control. So there are some things in life that we can control, mostly within ourselves, and there's some things that we can influence outside of that. But we shouldn't expect to be able to control everything. I know certainly as a control freak at times, I can absolutely relate to that. We do like to be able to control things, and especially other people, dare I say,
yeah.
that we like to control other people's behavior, but we can't.
Mm,
And I love this, what you said about being paralyzed by overthinking. Like, we're probably thinking about what other people are thinking about us, which is something that we absolutely cannot control.
mm,
And I think especially when we make changes, if we are perceived to be in this successful position, we start to make some small changes in our life, or we leave our job. I know when I left several jobs over the years, I was told that's a permanent pensionable job. Why are you leaving a permanent
Mm.
pensionable job? So it's this perception that other people have of us that we need to kind of catch that, I
Yeah.
suppose, as well. Um, I love the idea that it's a journey, and I imagine with a journey, there's never a destination. It's a continuous journey,
Mm.
and you might be at different stages of that journey. And this idea that we have a choice, so we need to choose how to respond. So it's about having that choice. And sometimes people believe that they don't have a choice.
Mm.
And it's like we always have a choice in how we respond to the situations that we find ourselves in. So absolutely love that. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we wrap up the
Mm.
conversation?
Yeah, just two things to emphasize what you beautifully summarized there. One is this overthinking. It's an experience that so many of us go through every single day. We end up thinking about our thinking about our thinking that we end up taking no action. And if we total up the number of hours we spend overthinking, just imagine if we were to shift those hours towards taking action. Imagine where you could be a year from now. And this idea of choice, even not choosing is a choice.
Yeah.
You've chosen not to make a decision. And so you've got to be conscious of the fact that your choices are either going to lead you to where you want to be, or they're going to lead you further away from where you want to be. And that's why it's so important to understand who you want to be first. And now, when I talk about who you want to be, I'm thinking about identity. What is your identity? Now, if you don't know what your identity is, then of course, you don't know the best route to take today. But once you work back from who you want to be, you can begin to embrace those behaviors now. And when I talk about behaviors, it's powerful because actually behaviors, your behavior, is one of the things that is immediately in your control. You can't change somebody else's behavior immediately, but you can certainly change your behavior. In fact, if you want to make progress, whether it's in your career, whether it's in your life, or any other area where you have goals for yourself, one of the quickest ways is not by adding more, but it's by stopping the behaviors that are stopping you from making the progress you want, that are sabotaging your journey. Look at the behaviors that you are embracing now and ask yourself, are they really helping me, or are they sabotaging where I want to be?
I love that. Helping or sabotaging. And something else that sprung to mind in relation to behavior is behavior is kind of the outward, and then inwardly there's the intention that we
Mhm.
have. And I think sometimes we confuse our intention with our actual behavior. So our behavior is how we're showing up in the world and what we're doing versus
Yeah.
how sometimes we perceive we are, when the two might not necessarily be related.
Definitely, definitely.
Simon, thank you so much for your time today on the Happier at Work podcast. The question I ask everyone who comes on the podcast: what does being happier at work mean to you?
Well, thank you so much for having me on. What does being happy at work mean for me? Happier at work means being in an environment where you feel supported, trusted, and appreciated, where you can share your ideas in a safe space. You can show up as your full human self, and where you find joy in the work that you do. That for me is what happy at work looks like.
Love that. A great synopsis, I think, of loads of different points there, and so important in the workplace.
Mhm.
If people want to reach out, if they want to connect with you, if they want to find out more about you, what you do, and also not forgetting if they want to find out more about your book, Energize, what's the best way they can do that?
Sure. So the best way to purchase a copy of Energize is to go to getenergizebook.com. That is Energize with a Z. On social media, I'm on all the platforms, but the two that I use most often are LinkedIn. You can search Simon Alexander Ong and click on the person. And then on Instagram, the handle is at Simon Alexander O.
Brilliant. Yeah, they're the two that I use most frequently as well. It's funny, isn't it? It's like one is for fun and behind the scenes, and the other is a little bit more professional, let's say. Simon, absolutely love the conversation today. Thank you absolutely so much for your time.
Thank you.